Oxygen Blast technical seminars are an Intertech production. For instructor-led .NET, Java, and XML courses, visit us at www.intertech.com.
Let's return now to the Hello World demo application in Visual Studio to take a look at configuration. Again, if we take a look at our Hello World type of application, we'll notice that underneath the Web Cloud project, we'll find two XML files, one called service configuration.cscfg and the other service definition.csdef. Both of these are XML files. In fact, by double-clicking on either one of them, I can bring up that XML configuration file. We'll talk about the differences between these two files and what they contain in just a moment. But one thing to note is while we can manually edit the configuration in both these XML files, we can also use what is a simpler UI provided by the application development capabilities of the Azure SDK by opening up what's known as the role configuration. In this case, our web role configuration. You'll notice there's a series of tabs on the role configuration. The information that we enter into this UI is actually placed inside of those two configuration files, those two XML files that we just saw. But it's a little bit more user-friendly way of providing that data. Seeing the configuration files for Windows Azure application. Let's look at some more details about that configuration. Again, the configuration is stored in two XML files, service definition.csdef and service configuration.cscfg. What's the difference between what's housed in these two files? Well, first of all, the service definition file essentially defines the roles and the endpoints for those roles. And what we find in terms of configuration defined in this file cannot be changed at runtime. What it does is essentially define the infrastructure for our applications, for our web and worker roles, defining things like configuration parameters, but not their actual values. For example, you'll notice here in this little XML file for our service definition file, we have one particular configuration setting called diagnostics connection string, but you'll notice there's no value set there, just the configuration parameter itself is established. Inside of the service configuration file, we'll find that we are defining the configuration per role and getting into more of the specifics. For example, defining the number of running instances that we have for a particular role, in this case 1. Also setting the actual configuration parameter values. For example, if you recall the diagnostic connection string set up in the service definition file, here we see its actual value established. In this case, use development storage equals true. So service configuration files are set up to allow for dynamic change. In other words, the values set up in the service configuration file can be changed at any time to include runtime versus service definition, which was static. And the data we see established inside the service configuration file can be accessed by applications in code, similar to what we find with regard to configuration files in web config. And again, we're provided by the Azure SDK with a nice graphical user interface to allow us to more easily change and set up values inside of both the definition and configuration XML files. Let's take a look at some of the information through the GUI that we can actually adjust in those configuration files. First off, we're able to set up the trust level. Do we want our Windows Azure application full trust or partial trust? Are we going to allow for unmanaged code to operate inside, or I should say, to be accessed by and running in our Azure environment? We're able to set up the number of instances for our roles, setting up the count, but also the size. Remember, size does matter in that you're going to pay for whatever size virtual machine you ask for. And we're also able to establish what the browser, which browser we should launch in terms of what type of endpoint we want. And this is only for what actually we see happening in Visual Studio in the Dev Fabric. This is not going to have any impact when we're actually running in the cloud. So do we want to set up and run with our push of F5 in HTTP mode or HTTPS mode? We're again able to set up configuration settings or configuration parameters, if you will. Here again is that example where we set up the diagnostic connection string and provide a value for that connection string. And if our application is running in some sort of HTTPS mode or needs some sort of SSL type of certificate, we can set that up in the Certificates tab. Let's now take a look at, once we have an application running in DevFabric, how to actually get it into the actual Azure cloud, into the actual fabric that runs Azure in the Microsoft data centers. So to deploy an application in the cloud, what will we need? Well, we'll have Visual Studio build us two files. One, an encrypted package of our code, and second, our configuration files. If you recall, when we explored in Chapter 1 how the application was actually deployed, we talked about how Windows Azure saw our environment, our application, as two things. The service, which essentially is that encrypted package of code, and the model, which is the information contained inside that configuration file. Once we've got those two files, we can deploy the application either through the Windows Azure portal, which is what we'll show you here today, or via script. Of course, you have to have an account in Azure, in the Azure Development Portal, to be able to log in and deploy an application. From there, you'll create a service and deploy your code. Now, this process can take some time, so allow at least about 20 minutes for an application to be deployed. So allow me to switch back over to Visual Studio to deploy our application. We'll click on our Welcome Cloud project, again, the project that defines both our configuration file and our roles. I'll right-click on that project and ask to Publish. Again, this is where the encrypted code package as well as the configuration package are created. What that will do for me is bring up two windows. One, a Windows Explorer window that actually provides me my two files, my encrypted package of code as well as my configuration file. And it opens up also a browser for me and allows me to sign in to the Windows Azure portal. So give me 1 second here as I first of all log in. So now I'm inside the Windows Azure portal. And the first thing I'll need to do is create a new service. So I'll click on my project name and ask to create a new service. From there, I have the choice of either establishing a new storage account or a new hosted service. Well, we're not creating storage at this point. All we're building is an application, so let's go ahead and create a new hosted service. At that point, I'm asked for a service label. We'll call this the Welcome Cloud Test. And I can provide any kind of service description that I'd like. At that point, I'm asked to establish a public URL for my new service. In this case, we'll call it Welcome Cloud, and you'll notice the rest of the URL is provided by the Windows Azure environment. I'll check the availability of that URL. And it looks good. Next, I get to choose which region would I like to have my application deployed to. In other words, which of the data centers out there in Microsoft should I have it deployed to? In this case, I'm going to ask to deploy it near me, which is the North Central US region. And go ahead and say Create. So now I've created a new service, but I've not yet deployed my code, my application code. We'll give it a second to create my service. And now we're greeted with a screen that allows us to actually provide for code to be deployed into my service. You'll notice that there are two different types of environments, if you will, that Azure provides for deploying your application: staging as well as production. Let's go ahead and deploy our application to staging first. When I ask to deploy to staging, this is where I'm asked for the upload location for both my encrypted package of code as well as the configuration setting file. This is where I can point it back to those files established by my Visual Studio application as it published my code. So allow me to grab the location of that code and have Windows Azure go to that location to pick up both my package of code, in this case Welcome Cloud CS package, as well as the configuration file, service configuration.cscfg. So now Windows Azure has those two files necessary to deploy my application. It also wants to give this a service deployment name. Most people use the version of the application as the deployment name, but you can use whatever name you'd like there. Momentarily, we'll see the application now in the process of being deployed. It's at this point, however, as I mentioned, that it might take some time for the application actually be deployed. Okay, so we now see our application is in the process of being deployed. We'll come back in a few minutes once it's ready to run. Okay, and now we're back. And we see that my deployed Welcome Cloud application is finally ready in staging. We get that indication with the ready indicator here. And we see a URL is provided to us to test the application. So if I click on that URL, indeed a browser will be opened, and I should see my hello everyone message sent by my Welcome Cloud application. Now this is in staging, so obviously that's the URL essentially for testing. We'll deploy it to production to see the file URL in just a second. But one thing to note, in this particular case again, we had one web role with one instance. If we push the configuration button, or the config button, we'll be taken to a screen that allows us to, again, dynamically change those configuration parameters and or things like the number of instances running. So now I actually see what was stored in my service configuration file, and I'm allowed to change it. For example, I could go out and change the number of instances from 1 to 2, for example. So through the service configuration file, I'm able to dynamically make changes in runtime. Now let's go back to the application and see the code running in production. The nice thing about the way that Windows Azure is set up is that moving the application once it's in staging to production is actually quite simple and not as time-consuming as making the first deployment. Simply hit the little button in the middle here, moving the application from staging to production. We'll ask if we're sure that we want to do this. And now moving to production only takes a matter of seconds. And that's because the way that the Fabric controller works behind the scenes for the Windows Azure Cloud is to just make some changes in the DNS entry, pointing things now to the production site, or I should say pointing our URL or making our URL active for the production site, but not actually moving our code inside the Windows Azure environment. In other words, the application is still running on the same instances out there. So now my application is up and running. All I need to do to test it is go ahead and click on the sample URL. And there again, our application is ready to go. So at this point, we encourage you to go out to the Windows Azure Platform Kit and take on a lab, the Guestbook Entry Lab, which is found in the Introduction to Windows Azure folder in the Labs folder of the Platform Kit. The lab will take you about 60 minutes. A couple things to remember. Remember to run Visual Studio as administrator, otherwise the Dev Fabric won't start. And also, if you're using Visual Studio 2010, the labs were built in Visual Studio 2008, and so when they're brought into your environment, it'll ask if you want to upgrade to .NET 4.0. You want to reply no to this. You want to keep the applications at .NET 3.5. Today, Windows Azure is still running in a 3.5 environment. Good luck, and we'll see you for Chapter 3.
For more free learning resources and to see the latest lineup of our instructor-led .NET, Java, and XML courses, visit us at www.intertech.com.